Bowling Green, Kentucky, July 1989. A town nestled in the rolling hills where summers were hot and humid, where families gathered at Fountain Square Park on weekends, and where everyone knew their neighbors and felt safe. Children played outside until dark, riding bikes through neighborhoods and climbing trees, and parents sat on front porches in the evenings watching the fireflies come out while talking with neighbors about everyday life in their small southern town. Amy Collins lived on Chestnut Street in a two-story house with a wide front porch, and she was 6 years old with curly brown hair that bounced when she ran, green eyes that sparkled with curiosity, and a bright smile that showed the gap where her front teeth were growing in. She loved wearing sundresses with flowers on them, collecting ladybugs in glass jars that she kept on her bedroom windowsill, and spending time with her older brother Michael, who was 10, and always looked out for her when they rode bikes or played together. Every summer, the Collins family had a tradition of holding a big picnic at Lost River Cave Park on the 4th of July weekend, inviting extended family, neighbors, and friends from church to join them for food, games, and fireworks when the sun went down. Linda Collins, Amy's mother, would spend days preparing potato salad, fried chicken, and her famous chocolate cake that everyone requested, while Robert Collins, Amy's father, would set up tables under the pavilion and organize the annual softball game. On Saturday, July 15, 1989, the Collins family loaded their station wagon with coolers, blankets, a folding table, and bags of food before driving to Lost River Cave Park, where they had reserved the large pavilion near the playground. By noon, the park was full of people, children running between tables and playing on the swings, adults sitting in lawn chairs talking and laughing, and the smell of grilled hamburgers and hot dogs filling the warm summer air as Robert manned the grill. Amy wore a yellow sundress with white daisies on it, white sandals that she kept kicking off so she could run barefoot in the grass, and a red ribbon tied in her curly hair that her mother had carefully arranged that morning despite Amy's squirming and protests. She played with her cousins near the playground, pushing each other on the swings and going down the slide over and over, her laughter carrying across the park, and Michael kept an eye on her from the softball field where the older kids were choosing teams. Linda took photographs throughout the afternoon with her new Canon camera, capturing moments of family and friends, children playing, people eating at picnic tables, and the beautiful Kentucky landscape with trees and hills in the background. She planned to develop the film later and put the pictures in the family album, preserving these memories of summer and togetherness, not knowing that one of those photographs would become crucial evidence decades later. Around 3 o'clock, Amy asked her mother if she could walk down to the creek that ran along the edge of the park, and Linda said yes, but told her to stay where she could see her, to not go too far, and to come back in 15 minutes. Amy nodded and skipped away toward the trail that led to the creek, her yellow dress bright against the green grass and trees, and Linda watched her go before turning back to help serve cake to the guests who were lining up with paper plates. Michael was still playing softball with his cousins and friends, hitting balls and running bases, and Robert was at the grill flipping burgers and talking with his brother-in-law, and everyone was enjoying the warm afternoon celebrating summer together. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30, and Linda looked toward the creek but did not see Amy's yellow dress anywhere, so she walked down to the trail calling Amy's name, expecting to find her playing in the water or collecting rocks. But Amy was not there. The creek was empty except for a few ducks swimming near the fallen log where Amy liked to sit and watch the water, and Linda's voice grew louder as she called again, walking further down the trail, looking behind trees. She ran back to the pavilion and found Robert, telling him Amy was not at the creek, and Robert immediately gathered Michael and several other men to start searching, calling Amy's name and spreading out across the park to check everywhere. Other families joined the search. Children were told to stay with their parents, and within minutes dozens of people were walking through the park, calling for Amy, looking in every direction, checking the playground, the restrooms, the parking lot, every possible place. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA Archives, where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. By 4 o'clock, someone called the Bowling Green Police Department, and officers arrived quickly, taking statements from Linda and Robert, asking when Amy was last seen, what she was wearing, if there had been any strangers at the picnic. Linda said she had not noticed anyone unusual, It was just family and friends and other families enjoying the park. And she described Amy's yellow sundress with daisies, her white sandals, the red ribbon in her hair, and the small ladybug bracelet on her wrist. Detective William Harper took lead on the case. He was 45 years old with 20 years of experience, and he organized an immediate search of the entire park, including the wooded areas, the trails, the cave entrance, and the areas near the river. Search dogs were brought in and they picked up Amy's scent near the creek where Linda had last seen her, following it down the trail toward the river, but then the scent disappeared near a gravel access road that park maintenance used. It was as if Amy had gotten into a vehicle, and that realization sent a wave of panic through everyone searching, because it meant this was not a case of a child wandering off and getting lost. It meant someone had taken her. The search continued through the evening and into the night with flashlights sweeping through the darkness, volunteers from the community arriving to help, and Amy's face already being broadcast on local television news with a description and a plea for information. Linda and Robert stayed at the park until midnight when officers finally convinced them to go home in case Amy somehow found her way there, and Michael sat silent in the back seat of the car staring out the window, unable to comprehend it. The investigation expanded over the following days with officers interviewing everyone who had been at the picnic, collecting names and contact information, asking if anyone had seen Amy leave the creek area or if anyone had noticed vehicles near the access road. They interviewed park employees, people who had been hiking the trails that day, families who had been at other pavilions, but no one had seen anything unusual. No one had seen Amy after she walked toward the creek, and no one had noticed suspicious vehicles. Linda developed the photographs from the picnic hoping they might contain some clue, some detail they had missed, and she spread them out on the dining room table, looking at each image carefully, studying the backgrounds and the faces. There were pictures of Amy playing on the swings, Amy eating watermelon with juice running down her chin, Amy holding hands with her cousins, and in the background of many photos were other families and people Linda did not know. One photograph in particular caught her attention, a shot of Amy near the pavilion taken around 2:30 in the afternoon, and in the background, partially obscured by a tree, was a man standing alone, watching the picnic from a distance. She showed the photograph to Detective Harper, who examined it closely. The man was white, appeared to be in his 30s or 40s, wearing a dark t-shirt and jeans, but his face was not clear enough to identify, partially shadowed and out of focus. Harper kept the photograph and had it analyzed, but the image quality was not good enough for facial recognition. The technology in 1989 was limited, and without a clearer picture or additional information, there was no way to track him down. The case began to cool as weeks turned into months. Tips came in, but none led anywhere. Searches continued, but Amy was not found, and the Collins family was left with unanswered questions and grief that had no resolution. Years passed, and the Collins family stayed in Bowling Green because they could not leave, feeling that leaving would mean abandoning Amy wherever she was. And Linda kept Amy's room exactly as it had been, with the bed made and stuffed animals arranged on the shelf. Robert stopped going to Lost River Cave Park, could not drive past it without feeling sick, could not think about that day without rage and guilt consuming him, and he threw himself into work at the factory, taking extra shifts to avoid being home where everything reminded him of Amy. Michael grew up carrying the weight of his sister's disappearance, remembering how he had been playing softball while Amy walked to the creek, how he had not gone with her, how he had not protected her like an older brother should have. He graduated high school in 1997 and studied criminal justice at Western Kentucky University, wanting to help other families find answers, wanting to make sure other children were not forgotten the way he feared Amy might be forgotten as years passed. Detective Harper retired in 2005 after 36 years with the Bowling Green Police Department, and he had worked Amy's case for 16 years, following every lead, interviewing hundreds of people, but never finding her or the man in the photograph. He handed the case file to a younger detective named Sarah Chen, who was 34, methodical and determined, and she read through the file multiple times, studying the witness statements, the search reports, and the photographs that Linda Collins had taken that day. By 2015, Amy's case was 26 years old, and Lost River Cave Park had changed with new pavilions built and old trails rerouted, but the core of the park remained the same, still drawing families on summer weekends for picnics and hikes. Detective Chen wanted to revisit the evidence, particularly the photographs, because digital enhancement technology had advanced significantly since 1989. and images that had been too blurry or dark to analyze before could now be clarified and enhanced. She took the original photographs to the Kentucky State Police Forensic Imaging Lab and asked them to digitize and enhance every image, particularly the one showing the man standing in the background watching the picnic from near the tree line. The technician scanned the photograph at high resolution and used specialized software to sharpen the image, adjust the contrast, reduce shadows, and bring out details that had been invisible in the original print. And what emerged was startling. The man's face became clearer, his features more defined, and the technician was able to enhance the image enough to see his facial structure, the shape of his jaw, his hairline, even a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow that had been hidden in shadow before. Detective Chen printed the enhanced image and began showing it to people who had been at the picnic that day, asking if anyone recognized the man, if anyone remembered seeing him at the park, if anyone knew who he was or why he had been there. Most people did not recognize him, said they had never seen him before, but then Chen showed the photograph to Robert Collins, who stared at it for a long time, his face going pale, and he said the man looked familiar, but he could not place where he knew him from. Chen asked him to think carefully, to try to remember any detail no matter how small, and Robert studied the image for several more minutes before something clicked in his memory, and he said the man looked like someone who had worked at the factory with him. Not in 1989, but years before, maybe 1986 or 87. A man who had been hired temporarily during a busy season and then let go after a few months. Someone Robert had not thought about in decades, but whose face now seemed eerily familiar. Robert could not remember the man's name, but he remembered he had been quiet, kept to himself, and there had been something off about him that made other workers uncomfortable, though no one could articulate exactly what it was. Chen contacted the factory and requested employment records from the mid-1980s, and after searching through old files, they found a list of temporary employees from that period, and one name stood out because of a notation in his file about behavioral concerns. The man's name was Dennis Wayne Keller. He had worked at the factory from March to September 1987, and the notation said he had been terminated after complaints from female employees about him watching them during breaks and making them uncomfortable. Chen ran his name through the system and found that Keller was now 62 years old, living in Franklin, Kentucky, about 30 minutes from Bowling Green, and he had been arrested in 2010 for stalking. His DNA entered into the database as part of his booking. She pulled his booking photo from 2010 and compared it to the enhanced photograph from the picnic, and even accounting for 21 years of aging, the resemblance was strong, the same facial structure, the same distinctive scar above the left eyebrow. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them. So if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive. New investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. Chen decided to approach this carefully. She needed to place Keller at the park on that specific day in July 1989, and she needed physical evidence that could connect him to Amy's disappearance. But after 26 years, that seemed nearly impossible. She went back to the case file and found that Linda Collins had saved everything from that day. Not just the photographs, but also the picnic supplies, the blanket they had been sitting on, even Amy's sandals that had been found near the creek after she disappeared. Chen called Linda and asked if she still had those items, and Linda said yes. She had kept them in boxes in the attic, unable to throw them away, unable to let go of the last physical connections to that day and to her daughter. Chen asked if she could examine the items, and Linda brought them to the police station in cardboard boxes that had been sealed for over 2 decades, and inside were the red and white checkered blanket, paper plates, plastic utensils, and Amy's small white sandals. Chen sent everything to the Kentucky State Police Crime Lab requesting DNA analysis, particularly on the sandals because if someone had picked up Amy or carried her, there might be touch DNA on the straps or the soles where someone's hands had held them. The lab processed the items carefully, and while most yielded no useful DNA beyond that of family members, one of Amy's sandals had a partial DNA profile on the ankle strap. Male, unknown, degraded but potentially usable for comparison. Chen requested a sample from Dennis Wayne Keller, but she needed probable cause for a warrant, so she began building her case by documenting the enhanced photograph, Robert's identification of Keller as a former co-worker, Keller's history of concerning behavior toward women and children. She discovered that Keller had been fired from 3 other jobs between 1988 and 1995 for similar issues: watching female employees, making inappropriate comments, being found in areas where he should not have been, and in 1992 he had been questioned about a missing girl. The girl had been found safe. She had simply gotten lost hiking, but witnesses had reported seeing a man matching Keller's description near the trail where she disappeared, and when police questioned him, he had no alibi, but there was no evidence linking him to anything. Chen had enough for a warrant, and she obtained one to collect a DNA sample from Keller, and on a Tuesday morning in November 2015, she and 2 other officers drove to his residence in Franklin to execute the warrant. Keller lived in a small rental house on the outskirts of Franklin, a single-story structure with peeling paint and an overgrown yard, and when Detective Chen knocked on the door, Keller answered wearing sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, looking older than his 62 years. Chen showed him the warrant and explained they needed a DNA sample, and Keller's face remained blank, expressionless, but his eyes shifted to the enhanced photograph Chen was holding, the image from the picnic showing him standing near the tree line, watching the Collins family. He asked what this was about, and Chen said they were investigating the disappearance of Amy Collins from Lost River Cave Park in July 1989, and she asked if he remembered being at the park that day, if he remembered seeing the Collins family. Keller said he did not remember, said he went to park sometimes, but that was a long time ago, and Chen asked if he had known Robert Collins from the factory, if he remembered working there in 1987. Keller hesitated before answering, then said yes, he had worked there briefly, and Chen asked why he had been at the park that day, why he had been watching the Collins family picnic, but Keller said he did not remember being there, said she must be mistaken. Chen showed him the enhanced photograph again, pointing out his face, the distinctive scar above his eyebrow, the clothing he was wearing, and Keller stared at the image for a long time before saying he wanted a lawyer and would not answer any more questions. The officers collected the DNA sample using a buccal swab, and Keller stood motionless while they did it, not resisting but not cooperating either, just staring at Chen with an expression she could not read, something between defiance and resignation. They drove back to Bowling Green, and Chen sent the sample to the crime lab with a request to compare it to the partial profile found on Amy's sandal, and the analysis took 6 weeks because the sample from the sandal was degraded and required careful processing. In January 2016, the results came back, and Chen sat at her desk reading the report, her hands shaking slightly, because the DNA from Dennis Wayne Keller matched the partial profile found on Amy's sandal with a probability of 1 in 800 million. Keller's DNA was on Amy's sandal, meaning he had touched her or carried her at some point, and combined with the photograph placing him at the park that day and his history of disturbing behavior, Chen had enough to arrest him. She obtained a warrant for his arrest on charges of kidnapping and murder, and on a cold morning in February 2016, officers surrounded Keller's house and took him into custody without incident, and he said nothing, did not ask questions, did not protest, just allowed himself to be handcuffed. At the police station, Chen read him his rights and placed him in an interrogation room, and she sat across from him with the enhanced photograph, the DNA results, and the case file spread out on the table between them. She asked Keller if he wanted to tell her what happened to Amy Collins, and Keller sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the photograph of himself at the park, at the image that had waited 26 years to reveal his face. Then he began to talk, slowly at first, saying he had been at the park that day because he knew Robert Collins from the factory, had seen the picnic announcement on a bulletin board at work, and he had gone there to watch. He said he had not planned anything, had just wanted to see the family, to watch from a distance, but then he saw Amy walk down to the creek alone, saw her yellow dress through the trees, and something in him decided to follow her. He walked down the trail, staying far enough behind that she would not notice him, and when Amy stopped at the creek to look at the water, Keller approached her, saying he was a friend of her father's from work, saying her dad had sent him to bring her back because it was time to leave. Amy hesitated, but Keller seemed friendly, seemed safe, and she was 6 years old and trusted adults. So when he said they should take the quick way back through the woods, she followed him, and Keller led her away from the creek toward the access road. His truck was parked there, hidden from view of the main park, and Amy asked why they were going to a truck instead of back to the pavilion, and Keller said her parents were meeting them at the parking lot, and Amy got in because she believed him. Chen asked where he took her, and Keller closed his eyes and he said he drove to a wooded area near Barren River Lake, about 20 miles from the park, and he said Amy started crying, saying she wanted her mother, trying to open the truck door. He said he panicked, did not want her to scream or try to escape, and he covered her mouth with his hand, pressed too hard, and Amy stopped struggling, stopped moving, and Keller sat there in his truck with her small body beside him, not knowing what to do. He wrapped her in a tarp he had in the truck bed and buried her in the woods near the lake, in a place he used to go fishing where no one ever walked, and he threw her sandals in the creek on his way out, trying to get rid of evidence, but one of them washed up on the bank. Chen asked if he remembered taking one of the sandals, and Keller said no, but the DNA did not lie. His skin cells had transferred to the strap when he carried Amy to the truck, or when he removed her sandals, leaving a trace that would wait 26 years to speak. Keller said he went home that night and watched the news, saw Amy's face, saw her parents crying and begging for her return, and he said he felt nothing, just relief that he had not been seen, that no one suspected him. He kept working odd jobs, kept living his quiet life, and he thought he had gotten away with it, thought the case would fade and Amy would become another unsolved disappearance, but he had not counted on technology advancing, on photographs being enhanced, on DNA lasting decades. Chen asked if he had any remorse, and Keller looked at her with empty eyes and said he was sorry he got caught, and Chen felt a wave of disgust, but kept her expression neutral, and she asked where exactly Amy was buried so the family could finally bring her home. Keller described the location, a clearing near the eastern shore of Barren River Lake, about 50 yards from the water, near a cluster of pine trees, and Chen wrote down every detail before standing up and walking out, unable to be in the same room with him anymore. She organized a search team and they drove to Barren River Lake the next morning with cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic specialists, and the area Keller described was remote and overgrown, rarely visited even by hikers or fishermen. The dogs alerted near the pine trees, and the team began to excavate carefully, removing layers of earth and vegetation that had accumulated over 26 years, and 3 feet down they found the tarp, decomposed and torn but still recognizable. Beneath it were bones, small and fragile, the skeleton of a child approximately 6 years old, and the remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office, where forensic analysis confirmed through dental records that it was Amy Collins. She had been there all along, less than 30 miles from home, buried in the woods while her family searched, while her face appeared on missing person posters, while her mother kept her room untouched, and her father worked himself into exhaustion. 20 years later, one overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth. A new case drops every day on the DNA archives. Detective Chen called the Collins family and asked if they could come to the station, and Linda, Robert, and Michael drove there in silence, each of them knowing what this call meant, each of them having prepared for this moment for 26 years but still feeling unprepared. They sat in a conference room and Chen sat across from them, and she told them they had found Amy, told them she was coming home, and Linda covered her face with her hands, making no sound, while Robert stared at the wall, and Michael closed his eyes. Chen told them about the photograph enhancement, about finding Keller, about the DNA match on Amy's sandal, about the confession and the location where Amy had been buried, and she said Keller was in custody and would face charges for what he had done. Linda asked if Amy had suffered, and Chen said based on Keller's confession it had been quick, that Amy had not been held captive or tortured, and while that did not make it better, it was something. And Michael asked why Keller had been at the park that day. Chen explained that Keller had known Robert from the factory, had seen the picnic announcement and decided to go, had been watching the family from a distance, and when he saw Amy alone he had taken the opportunity, and Robert made a sound like all the air had left his body. He said he remembered Keller from work, remembered the man had made people uncomfortable, and if he had known Keller was at the park that day, he would have kept Amy closer, would have protected her. But Chen said there was no way he could have known. The funeral was held 3 weeks later in March 2016, 26 years after Amy disappeared, and the service was at State Street United Methodist Church, where the Collins family had attended when Amy was alive, where Amy had gone to Sunday school. The sanctuary was full of family, friends, People who had searched for Amy, people who had never forgotten her, and the casket was small and white, covered in yellow flowers because yellow had been Amy's favorite color, the color of the sundress she had worn that day. Pastor Reynolds spoke about faith, about a child's innocence, about the cruelty of the world and the mystery of why God allows such things to happen. And Linda did not hear most of it. She just stared at the casket, thinking about her daughter. She thought about the last time she had seen Amy, watching her skip toward the creek in her yellow dress. Thought about all the birthdays Amy never had, the life stolen from her by a man who had been watching from the shadows. After the service, they drove to Fairview Cemetery, where a plot had been prepared on a gentle hill with a view of the valley, and the headstone was simple with Amy's name, her birth and death years, and the words, "Forever our little girl," beneath a carved image of a ladybug. Linda placed one of Amy's glass jars on the grave, the one Amy had used to collect ladybugs, and Robert stood beside her, unable to speak, unable to process that this was real, that they were burying their daughter after 26 years of not knowing. Michael stayed back watching his parents, thinking about the little sister who had followed him everywhere, who had looked up to him, who he had failed to protect, and he thought about Dennis Keller sitting in a jail cell, the man whose face in a photograph had finally revealed the truth. Dennis Wayne Keller was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence, and his public defender advised him to plead not guilty, to fight the charges, to argue that the DNA evidence was not conclusive and the confession was coerced. But Keller refused, saying he did not want a trial, did not want the Collins family to sit through weeks of testimony and evidence, and in May 2016, he entered a guilty plea to all charges in a courtroom packed with people. Linda and Robert sat in the front row with Michael beside them, and Keller stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit with his hands shackled, and for the first time since his arrest, he looked at the Collins family directly. Linda stared back at him with an expression of pure hatred, and Keller's face showed no emotion, no remorse, just a blank emptiness that made him seem less than human, and the judge asked if he understood the charges against him. Keller said he did, and the judge asked if he was pleading guilty of his own free will without coercion or promises, and Keller said he was, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole plus 30 years for the kidnapping. Keller was led away in handcuffs and chains, and he did not look back at the Collins family, did not say anything, just walked out of the courtroom and disappeared from their lives forever. And Linda felt Robert's hand squeeze hers, but she could not squeeze back. She was numb, hollowed out by 26 years of grief and now by the finality of knowing exactly what had happened, knowing that a man had watched their family picnic and chosen their daughter, had stolen her and buried her and gone on living his life. They walked out of the courtroom together and reporters were waiting outside with cameras and microphones, but the Collins family did not stop, did not make statements. They just walked to their car and drove home in silence. The days after the sentencing were strange. The question that had defined their lives for 26 years was finally answered, but the answer brought no peace, only a different kind of pain, the pain of knowing exactly how Amy had died and where she had been all those years. Robert returned to work but found it difficult to concentrate, kept thinking about Keller working at the same factory, walking the same halls, and how close evil had been without anyone knowing, and he requested a transfer to a different shift, different building, anywhere he did not have to think about it. Linda returned to the cemetery every week, bringing fresh flowers and sitting beside Amy's grave, talking to her the way she had when Amy was small, telling her about family, about Michael and his life, about the grandchildren Amy would never meet. Michael continued his work in law enforcement, having joined the Bowling Green Police Department in 2010, and he worked in the same building where his sister's case file had sat for decades, where Detective Harper had worked tirelessly to find answers. He requested to work cold cases, wanting to help other families the way Detective Chen had helped his, wanting to make sure other children were not forgotten. And he learned from Chen, studied her methods, her persistence, her refusal to let old cases stay closed. The photograph that had broken the case open became a teaching tool, used in forensic classes and law enforcement training, to demonstrate the importance of preserving all evidence, even evidence that seemed insignificant at the time, like background images and family photos. Detective Chen was invited to speak at conferences about the case, about how digital enhancement technology had revealed a face that had been hidden in shadows for 26 years, about how a single photograph combined with DNA evidence had solved a case that many had assumed would never be solved. She showed the original photograph and the enhanced version side by side, demonstrated the techniques used to clarify the image, and emphasized that evidence never truly became useless. It simply waited for technology to advance enough to unlock its secrets. The case was covered in documentaries and true crime podcasts, and the Collins family declined most interview requests, not wanting to relive the worst experience of their lives for entertainment. But Linda did agree to one interview with a local journalist who had covered Amy's disappearance in 1989. In the interview, Linda said that for 26 years she had lived in a kind of purgatory, not knowing if Amy was alive or dead, if she was being held somewhere, or if she was gone, and the not knowing had been a special kind of torture that never ended. She said that knowing the truth was painful, but it was better than the uncertainty, better than the endless wondering and hoping and fearing. And she said she was grateful to Detective Chen for never giving up, for looking at old evidence with new eyes, for bringing Amy home. The impact of Amy's case extended beyond Bowling Green as police departments across Kentucky and neighboring states began re-examining their own cold case files, pulling out boxes of evidence that had been stored for decades and looking for photographs that might contain similar clues. They realized that family photos, vacation snapshots, pictures taken at public events might contain faces in the background, people who had not been identified or questioned, and with modern enhancement technology, those faces could be revealed and potentially identified. In Louisville, a case from 1992 was reopened after investigators found photographs from a county fair where a teenage girl had disappeared, and in the background of several photos was the same man, watching, following, and enhancement revealed his face clearly enough to identify him. In Nashville, Tennessee, a case from 1987 was solved after investigators enhanced photographs from a shopping mall where a boy had vanished, and a man in the background of multiple photos was identified through facial recognition, and his DNA matched evidence from the scene. Amy's case had shown that predators often inserted themselves into situations where children were present, watching and waiting for opportunities, and photographs captured those moments even when no one noticed the person at the time, preserving evidence that could speak decades later. Detective Michael Collins worked a case in 2019 involving a disappearance from 2001, and he found photographs from a school carnival that the missing girl had attended, and he had them enhanced looking for anyone who appeared in multiple photos watching children. He found a man who appeared in 7 different photos over the course of 3 hours, always in the background, always watching, and enhancement revealed his face clearly, and Michael ran him through databases finding a name and a history of concerning behavior. The man was brought in for questioning, and while he denied involvement initially, the DNA collected from a water bottle the girl had been drinking before she disappeared matched his profile, and he eventually confessed, and another family finally got answers after 18 years. Michael thought about his sister every time he worked a case, thought about the photograph from the picnic, about how his mother had taken that picture not knowing it would become the key to solving Amy's disappearance, not knowing a predator was watching from the trees. Linda Collins kept that photograph in a frame on her bedside table, the enhanced version showing Keller's face clearly, and people asked her why she would want to look at the man who killed her daughter, but Linda said it reminded her that evil was real and often hidden. She said it reminded her to pay attention, to notice who was watching, to trust her instincts when something felt wrong, and she volunteered at a child safety organization, teaching parents about awareness and vigilance, turning her grief into purpose. Robert Collins died in 2021 from a massive stroke at the age of 67, and the doctors said it was sudden and he did not suffer. But Michael knew his father had been dying slowly for 32 years, carrying the weight of Amy's loss every single day. Robert had never fully recovered from the guilt of not noticing Keller at the picnic, of not protecting his daughter, of letting her walk to the creek alone, and even though everyone told him it was not his fault, he had never forgiven himself. Linda lived alone after that with Michael visiting often, bringing groceries and fixing things around the house, and they would sit together looking through old photo albums, remembering Amy not just as a victim, but as the bright, curious child who had loved ladybugs and sundresses. They remembered her laughter, her gap-toothed smile, the way she would follow Michael around asking endless questions, and Linda said she wanted people to remember Amy as a person, not just as a tragedy, as a daughter who was loved and still loved. Dennis Keller remained in prison at the Kentucky State Penitentiary, and he did not appeal his sentence, did not request any hearings, and he worked in the prison laundry keeping to himself, and other inmates knew what he had done and what he was. Child predators were not well liked in prison, and Keller had been assaulted twice in his first year, once severely enough that he spent 3 weeks in the medical unit, but he survived and learned to stay invisible, moving through the prison like a ghost. He received no visitors, no letters, no contact with the outside world, and he existed in isolation, and guards who worked his block said he never spoke unless spoken to, never caused trouble, just served his time with a blank expression that suggested he felt nothing. The photograph that had revealed his face hung in the Bowling Green Police Department's cold case unit, mounted on the wall beside the solved case board, and new detectives were shown the image during their training, learning the story of how enhancement technology and persistence had brought justice. They learned that evidence could wait decades to speak, that photographs contained more information than what was immediately visible, and that families deserved investigators who would not give up, who would keep searching for answers no matter how much time had passed. Detective Chen retired in 2026 after 35 years in law enforcement, and Amy's case remained the one she was most proud of, not because it was the most complex, but because it had mattered, because she had given a family closure after 26 years. On her last day, she visited Amy's grave at Fairview Cemetery, bringing yellow flowers and standing there for a long time, thinking about the 6-year-old girl who had gone to a family picnic and never came home. And she thought about the photograph that had waited so long to reveal its secret. She thought about how Linda Collins had taken that picture to preserve happy memories, not knowing she was documenting the presence of a predator, and how that single image had become the key to solving a case that had seemed unsolvable. Chen placed the flowers on the grave and said a quiet goodbye to Amy, promising that her story would continue to be told, would continue to teach others about vigilance and persistence, would continue to give hope to families still waiting for answers. The science that solved Amy's case continued to evolve with new enhancement techniques being developed, with artificial intelligence being used to clarify images, with facial recognition databases growing larger and more sophisticated every year. Cold cases across the country were being reopened and solved, photographs were being enhanced, faces were being identified, and families were receiving phone calls they had stopped hoping for, learning that their loved ones had been found, that someone had been arrested, that justice was finally coming. It was not always closure in the traditional sense because nothing could bring back the lost years, nothing could undo the trauma and grief, but it was truth, and truth mattered, and knowing was better than the endless uncertainty of not knowing. The town of Bowling Green changed in subtle ways after Amy's case was solved, not in obvious ways that visitors would notice, but the people who had lived through her disappearance carried the knowledge differently now, understanding that danger could hide in plain sight. Parents at Lost River Cave Park watched their children more carefully, stayed closer, paid attention to who was nearby, and the park installed additional security cameras and required all visitors to sign in at the entrance, changes that came too late for Amy, but might protect future children. The pavilion where the Collins family had held their picnic was renovated in 2018, and the Park Commission installed a small memorial plaque near the playground, a simple bronze marker that read, "In memory of Amy Collins, forever 6, may all children play safely." Children passed it every day without knowing the full story, but their parents knew, and they used Amy's story as a teaching moment, explaining stranger danger and the importance of staying with trusted adults, turning tragedy into education and awareness. Michael Collins's daughter turned 6 in 2023, the same age Amy had been when she disappeared, and Michael felt the weight of that milestone more than he expected, watching his daughter play and realizing how young Amy had been, how vulnerable. He had always known intellectually that Amy was 6, but seeing his own daughter at that age brought new understanding, and he held her closer, watched her more carefully, and struggled with anxiety every time she was out of his sight. His wife understood, knew the trauma his family had endured, and they talked about it openly, about fear and protection, and the balance between keeping children safe and letting them experience life, and Michael worked with a therapist to manage the anxiety that sometimes overwhelmed him. Linda Collins continued her visits to the cemetery every week, bringing fresh flowers and maintaining Amy's grave with care, pulling weeds and cleaning the headstone, and she talked to Amy about everything happening in the world, about Michael and his family, about the years that had passed. She wondered sometimes what Amy would have become, what career she might have chosen, who she would have married, what kind of mother she would have been. But those questions had no answers, only the painful awareness of all that had been stolen. Linda turned 70 in 2024, and Michael organized a small family gathering to celebrate. But later that evening, when she was alone, Linda looked at the photograph of Amy on her dresser, the school picture from spring 1989 showing her gap-toothed smile. She thought about how young she had been when Amy disappeared, only 44 years old with her whole life ahead of her, and how the disappearance had defined everything that came after, shaping her identity as the mother of a missing child, and then as the mother of a murdered child. She had lived almost half her life not knowing what happened to Amy, and now she knew. And while the knowledge was painful, it was also a kind of freedom, release from the uncertainty that had consumed her for 26 years. The photograph that solved the case remained in the evidence room at the Bowling Green Police Department, both the original print and the enhanced digital version, preserved as a crucial piece of history and a teaching tool for future investigators. Students from Western Kentucky University's criminal justice program visited the department regularly, and they were shown the photograph along with the case file, learning about the importance of preserving all evidence and the potential for technology to reveal information that was invisible to the naked eye. They learned about Dennis Keller, about how predators often inserted themselves into situations with children, about how awareness and vigilance could prevent tragedies, and they learned about Detective Chen's persistence and refusal to let the case remain unsolved. The case was featured in a documentary called Hidden in Plain Sight that aired in 2025, detailing Amy's disappearance, the 26-year search for answers, the photograph enhancement that revealed Keller's face, and the DNA evidence that confirmed his guilt. Linda agreed to appear in the documentary, her first and only on-camera interview, because she wanted people to understand the impact of Amy's loss, not just on their family, but on everyone who knew them, everyone who searched, everyone who held on to hope for decades. She spoke calmly and clearly about the day Amy disappeared, about the years of not knowing, about the moment Detective Chen called to say they had found Amy, and she emphasized that while she was grateful for answers, nothing could replace the daughter she had lost. The documentary won awards and was used in criminal justice courses across the country, and it sparked conversations about cold case investigations, about the importance of funding forensic technology, and about supporting families who lived in the limbo of not knowing. Dennis Keller watched the documentary from prison where inmates gathered in the common room, and when Amy's face appeared on screen, the room went silent, and Keller sat in the back corner expressionless, watching himself on screen standing near the tree line at the picnic. He watched the enhanced photograph that had exposed him, watched Linda Collins talk about losing her daughter, watched the reenactment of his arrest and confession, and when it ended, he stood up and walked back to his cell without speaking to anyone. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, thinking about the photograph, about how he had been so careful to stay in the background, to avoid cameras, to not draw attention, but Linda Collins had captured him anyway without even knowing it. He thought about how a family vacation photo had become evidence, how technology had advanced enough to see his face clearly, how DNA from touching a child's sandal had lasted 26 years, and he understood that he had never really been safe. The evidence had always existed. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives where it's free. It helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence, and new stories of truth and closure are released every single day, because families deserve answers and evidence deserves to be heard. The years moved forward and Amy's case faded from headlines as new stories took its place. But in Bowling Green, her memory remained alive through the memorial plaque, through the work of child safety organizations, and through the families who used her story to teach their children about awareness. Lost River Cave Park implemented new safety protocols, including regular patrols by park rangers, emergency call boxes installed along trails, and a buddy system requirement for children under 12, ensuring no child could wander off alone the way Amy had. These changes came too late for Amy, but they created a legacy, turning tragedy into prevention, and Linda Collins volunteered with the Park Commission to help develop educational materials about child safety, that were distributed to every family who visited. She gave talks at schools and community centers about the importance of supervision, about teaching children when it was okay to trust strangers and when it was not, and she spoke plainly about what had happened to Amy, never sugarcoating the reality, but always emphasizing prevention. Michael Collins became a sergeant in 2027, supervising the cold case unit at the Bowling Green Police Department, and he trained new detectives using Amy's case as a primary example of how persistence and technology could solve cases that seemed impossible. He taught them about evidence preservation, about the importance of photographs and seemingly insignificant items, about how DNA could survive for decades if properly stored, and he told them that every case represented a family still waiting, still hoping, still deserving of answers. He told them about his sister, about the photograph his mother had taken without knowing it would solve the case 26 years later, about Detective Chen's decision to enhance old evidence, about the moment they learned the truth after spending most of their lives not knowing. Young detectives listened carefully and understood that cold cases were not just files in storage. They were real people, real families, real grief that lasted generations, and they learned that giving up was not an option because someone's mother or father or sibling was still waiting. Detective Sarah Chen spent her retirement writing a book about her career, focusing on Amy's case and several others she had solved. And the book was called Faces in the Background: How Hidden Evidence Solves Cold Cases, and it was published in 2028. The book detailed the investigation step by step, from the original 1989 case file through the photograph enhancement, the identification of Keller, the DNA match, and the recovery of Amy's remains, and it included technical information about forensic imaging and DNA analysis. It became required reading in forensic science programs and was praised by law enforcement professionals for its clear explanation of investigative techniques, and Linda Collins wrote the foreword, thanking Chen for never giving up on Amy and encouraging other investigators to show the same dedication. Chen donated all proceeds from the book to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and she gave talks at universities and conferences about the importance of cold case units, about fighting for funding and resources, about believing that answers existed even after decades. In 2029, a new technology emerged using artificial intelligence to analyze and enhance photographs beyond what traditional software could accomplish, and police departments began using it to re-examine evidence from even older cases, going back to the 1960s and 70s. Faces that had been completely invisible in original photos were revealed. License plates that had been too blurry to read became legible, and background details that investigators had never noticed before emerged with startling clarity, and more cases were solved as a result. Amy's case was cited as the breakthrough that had sparked this renewed focus on photographic evidence, and law enforcement agencies across the country began training officers specifically in photograph analysis, creating specialist positions focused on finding faces in backgrounds. Michael worked one such case in 2030, a disappearance from 1994 where a woman had vanished from a farmer's market, and photographs from that day were enhanced using the new AI technology, revealing a man who appeared in multiple photos following the woman. The man was identified, his DNA matched evidence from the woman's abandoned car, and he was arrested 36 years after the crime, and another family finally received answers. And Michael thought about how his sister's case had created ripples that extended far beyond their family. Linda Collins' health began to decline in 2031 with arthritis making it difficult to walk and heart problems requiring medication, and she moved more slowly now, visiting the cemetery less frequently, not because she wanted to, but because her body would not cooperate. Michael drove her when he could, walking slowly beside her to Amy's grave, standing quietly while she talked to her daughter about grandchildren Amy would never meet, about the world that had changed so much since 1989, about how much she was missed. They did not always talk during these visits. Sometimes they just stood together in silence, and Michael understood that his mother was preparing to let go, not of Amy's memory, but of the physical act of visiting, of maintaining the grave, of holding on so tightly. Linda told Michael that when she died, she wanted to be buried next to Amy, and she wanted her headstone to include a ladybug like Amy's, and she wanted the inscription to read, "Together Again," and Michael promised he would make sure it happened exactly as she wanted. Dennis Keller's health also declined in prison. Diabetes and heart disease compounded by years of poor diet and lack of medical care, and he was moved to the prison medical unit in 2032, where he spent his days in a small room with barred windows. He received no visitors, no letters, no contact with anyone outside the prison walls, and the guards who worked the medical unit said he never complained, never asked for anything, just existed in silence waiting for death to come. He had been in prison for 16 years and he would die there, and no one would mourn him, no one would attend his funeral, and his body would be cremated and scattered without ceremony, forgotten by a world that had no use for men like him. The contrast was stark between how Amy was remembered and how Keller would be forgotten, between the memorial plaque and the flowers on her grave, and the unmarked disposal of his ashes, and that seemed right to everyone who knew the story. Amy Collins had existed for only 6 years, but her impact lasted decades, teaching lessons about safety and awareness, inspiring investigators to never give up, showing that truth could emerge from photographs taken without intent, and her memory lived on through her family. Keller had lived 68 years but would leave nothing behind except pain, and the cautionary tale of a predator who thought he had gotten away with murder, but was revealed by a mother's vacation snapshot, and the persistence of detectives who refused to let the case go cold. The impact of photographic evidence in cold cases expanded dramatically in the years following Amy's case, with police departments creating dedicated units focused specifically on analyzing images from unsolved crimes, and federal grants were made available to fund the technology needed for enhancement and analysis. The FBI created a national database where law enforcement agencies could upload photographs from cold cases, and specialists used advanced software to enhance images, identify faces, and cross-reference them with other cases, looking for patterns and connections that might have been missed decades earlier. In Georgia, a case from 1983 was solved when photographs from a carnival were enhanced, revealing a man who appeared in 7 different photos near where a child had disappeared, and facial recognition identified him as a convicted offender in another state. In Oregon, a case from 1991 was solved when family photos from a camping trip were analyzed, and a man visible in the background was identified through enhancement and genealogical DNA analysis, leading to an arrest 32 years after the crime. Amy's photograph, the one showing Keller watching from near the tree line, was used in training materials for these new units, demonstrating how predators inserted themselves into situations with children, how they observed and waited for opportunities, and how cameras captured them even when no one noticed at the time. Detective Michael Collins worked closely with the FBI's new photographic analysis unit, consulting on cases and sharing techniques his department had developed, and he traveled to Quantico to give presentations about Amy's case and the importance of examining every photograph from crime scenes. He showed the original photograph and the enhanced version, walking investigators through the process of how Keller was identified, how the DNA connected him to Amy, and how persistence and technology working together had brought justice after 26 years. Young FBI agents asked questions about the emotional toll of working his own sister's case, and Michael was honest, saying it had been both devastating and healing, that knowing the truth was better than living in uncertainty, and that turning grief into purpose had given meaning to Amy's death. He told them that every unsolved case represented a family living in that same uncertainty, waiting for the phone call that would change everything, and he challenged them to care about those families the way Detective Chen had cared about his, to never stop searching for answers. Linda Collins gave her last public talk in 2033 at a child safety conference in Louisville, and she was 79 years old, moving slowly with a cane, but her voice was strong and clear as she told Amy's story to an audience of parents, teachers, and law enforcement. She showed the photograph of Amy in her yellow sundress, talked about the family picnic, about letting Amy walk to the creek alone, about the moment she realized Amy was gone, and she was brutally honest about the guilt she had carried for 44 years. She said she had blamed herself for not watching more carefully, for not noticing Keller in the background, for not sensing danger, and she said that guilt had nearly destroyed her, but she had learned that predators were skilled at hiding, at seeming normal, at exploiting moments of opportunity. She told the audience that parents could not watch their children every single second, that life required trust and some level of independence, but she urged them to be aware, to notice who was watching their children, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. She said that if her story could save even one child by making parents more vigilant, then Amy's death would have meaning beyond tragedy, and she received a standing ovation, and many in the audience were crying, and Linda knew this would be her final talk. She was tired, ready to rest, and she had said everything she needed to say, and she flew home to Bowling Green with Michael, looking out the airplane window at the Kentucky landscape below, thinking about Amy buried in the earth somewhere down there. Robert's grave was next to Amy's at Fairview Cemetery, and Linda visited them together now, bringing flowers for both, sitting on the bench nearby and talking to them about family, about the years that had passed, about being ready to join them when her time came. Michael visited his mother every Sunday, and they would sit together in her living room looking through photo albums, and Linda would point out pictures of Amy, telling stories about her personality, her quirks, the things that made her unique beyond being a victim. She wanted Michael's children to know their aunt not as a tragedy, but as a person, as the little girl who collected ladybugs and loved yellow dresses and followed her big brother everywhere, and Michael understood this was his mother's way of keeping Amy alive for future generations. In 2034, the Bowling Green Police Department created the Amy Collins Memorial Cold Case Fund, dedicated to providing resources for investigating unsolved missing children cases, and the fund paid for DNA testing, photograph enhancement, and training for detectives specializing in cold cases. Linda was invited to the dedication ceremony but was too ill to attend, so Michael represented the family, and he accepted a plaque in his mother's honor, and he gave a short speech about how his sister's case had shown that answers were possible even after decades. He thanked Detective Chen, who was in attendance, now 81 years old but still sharp and engaged, and he thanked all the investigators who had worked Amy's case over the years, who had kept her file active, who had never given up hope that truth would emerge. The fund raised over $200,000 in its first year through donations from community members, businesses, and law enforcement organizations, and it was used to solve 3 cold cases in Kentucky within 18 months, bringing closure to families who had waited years for answers. Dennis Keller died in prison in October 2034 from heart failure. He was 77 years old, and there was no funeral service, no obituary, no public announcement, just a notation in prison records that he had died and been cremated. His ashes were held for 60 days as required by law, and when no one claimed them, they were scattered in an unmarked location on prison grounds, and the world moved on without acknowledging his passing, and his name faded from memory except as the man who killed Amy Collins. Linda Collins was notified of his death by the Victim Services Coordinator from the prosecutor's office, and she felt nothing. No relief or satisfaction or closure, just a hollow acknowledgement that Keller was gone, and Amy was still gone, and nothing had changed. She told Michael she was glad Keller had died in prison, glad he had spent his final years in isolation and poor health, but she said his death did not bring Amy back, did not heal the wound, did not make the past 45 years of grief disappear. Michael understood. He felt the same emptiness, and he realized that justice was not about revenge or satisfaction. It was about truth and accountability, about ensuring that what happened to Amy was documented and acknowledged and prevented from happening to others. The photograph remained on the wall in the cold case unit, a reminder of what was possible when investigators refused to give up, when families preserved evidence without knowing its importance, when technology advanced enough to reveal secrets hidden in plain sight. The town of Bowling Green continued to grow and change. New families moved in and old ones moved away, but those who had lived through Amy's disappearance carried the memory differently now, understanding that the story had a resolution, even if that resolution was heartbreaking. Lost River Cave Park remained a popular destination for families, and the memorial plaque for Amy was cleaned and maintained by park staff, and fresh flowers appeared there regularly, placed by people who remembered or by those who learned the story and wanted to honor her memory. The pavilion where the Collins family had held their final picnic together was renamed the Amy Collins Pavilion in 2035, and a larger memorial was installed featuring a bronze statue of a little girl reading a book, sitting on a bench where visitors could sit beside her. The statue was dedicated at a ceremony attended by hundreds of people, including Linda Collins, who was now 81 and in declining health, and she sat in a wheelchair beside the statue, touching the bronze hand gently, and she whispered something that no one else could hear. Michael stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder, and his children stood nearby. Amy's niece and nephew, who had heard stories about their aunt all their lives, who understood that she was not just a name but a real person who had been loved and was still loved. Linda's health continued to deteriorate through 2035 with her heart growing weaker, and she spent more time sleeping than awake. And Michael knew the end was coming, knew his mother was ready to let go, to be reunited with Amy and Robert. He sat with her every evening, reading to her from the Bible and from poetry books she loved, and sometimes she would open her eyes and smile at him, and she would say Amy's name, and Michael would tell her that Amy was waiting, that it was okay to go. Linda Collins died peacefully in her sleep on December 23, 2035, 46 years after Amy's disappearance, and Michael found her in the morning with a photograph of Amy clutched in her hand, the school picture from spring 1989. The funeral was held between Christmas and New Year's at State Street United Methodist Church, and the sanctuary was full of people whose lives Linda had touched through her advocacy work, her talks about child safety, and her example of how to survive unimaginable loss with grace. Pastor Williams spoke about Linda's strength and faith, about her devotion to keeping Amy's memory alive, about her work to prevent other families from experiencing what she had endured, and he said she had transformed tragedy into purpose and grief into service. Michael delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking at times but remaining steady, and he talked about his mother's love for Amy, about the 26 years she waited for answers, about the final 20 years she spent honoring Amy's memory through education and awareness. He said his mother had taught him that grief never fully healed, but could be channeled into something meaningful, and he thanked her for showing him how to live with loss, how to find purpose in pain, and how to keep fighting for justice and truth. Linda was buried between Robert and Amy at Fairview Cemetery, and the 3 headstones formed a row under the oak tree, a family reunited in death, and Linda's headstone had a ladybug carved into it as she had requested, matching Amy's, and the inscription read, "Together again." Michael stood at the graves after everyone else had left, looking at the 3 names, his father, his sister, his mother, and he thought about how his family had been shattered by one afternoon in July 1989, how they had spent decades searching for truth and healing. He thought about the photograph his mother had taken at the picnic, how she had been trying to capture happy memories not knowing she was documenting the presence of evil, and how that photograph had waited 26 years to speak, to reveal the face that solved everything. He was grateful for Detective Chen's persistence, for the technology that made enhancement possible, for the DNA that survived on Amy's sandal, for all the pieces that had come together to bring truth, and he was grateful his mother had lived to see justice even if it could not bring Amy back. Dennis Wayne Keller was forgotten by everyone except as a name in case files and training materials, as an example of how predators operated and how they were caught, and his legacy was nothing except the pain he had caused and the lives he had destroyed. Amy Collins was remembered differently, her story told in schools and conferences, her case studied by investigators, her memory honored through the fund that bore her name, and she lived on through the children who were protected by lessons learned from her tragedy. The photograph that solved her case remained mounted in the cold case unit at the Bowling Green Police Department, and new detectives were brought to see it during orientation, learning that evidence could speak across decades if preserved properly and examined with advancing technology. They learned about the importance of photographs, about looking at backgrounds and faces that were not the primary subjects, about how predators inserted themselves into situations and were often captured by cameras without anyone noticing until much later. Michael Collins continued to lead the cold case unit, and he solved 69 cases during his career, bringing closure to families who had waited years and sometimes decades for answers, and he trained a new generation of detectives using Amy's case as the foundation of their education. He taught them about persistence, about caring for the families behind every file, about using every available technology and resource, about never accepting that a case was truly unsolvable, and he told them about his sister, about his mother, about his family's journey from uncertainty to truth. In 2039, on the 50th anniversary of Amy's disappearance, the Bowling Green community held a memorial service at Lost River Cave Park, and hundreds of people gathered at the Amy Collins Pavilion to remember her and to honor all missing children. Michael was there with his family, and Detective Chen attended at 96 years old. moving slowly but still clear-minded, and they stood together by the bronze statue, and Chen placed a yellow flower in the statue's hand, and she whispered that she had kept her promise to never give up. The service included a moment of silence, and then children from the community released yellow balloons into the summer sky, one for each year since Amy's disappearance, and the balloons drifted up over the trees, over the creek, over the park where a 6-year-old girl had played for the last time. Michael watched the balloons rise and thought about how his sister's story had created ripples that extended far beyond their family, how it had changed investigative practices, how it had taught awareness, how it had given hope to other families that truth could emerge even after decades. He thought about the photograph, about how his mother's simple act of taking pictures at a family picnic had preserved evidence that would solve a case 26 years later, and he thought about how every moment was captured somehow, stored somewhere, waiting to reveal its secrets. Michael Collins retired in 2042 after 32 years in law enforcement, and he had solved 87 cold cases during his career, bringing answers to families who had waited years and decades, and he had trained hundreds of detectives who carried forward his philosophy of persistence and care. On his last day, he stood in the cold case unit looking at the photograph of Amy mounted on the wall, the enhanced image showing Dennis Keller watching from the tree line, and he remembered the day Detective Chen had shown his family that image, the moment everything changed. He touched the frame gently and whispered thank you, not to anyone specific but to the evidence that had finally spoken, to his mother who had taken the photograph, to Detective Chen who had enhanced it, to the DNA that had survived, to all the pieces that had aligned to bring truth. He walked out of the police department for the final time, and he went home to his wife and children, to the life he had built on the foundation of loss and purpose, and he understood now that grief had transformed him, had made him who he was, had given meaning to his career. He had learned that some wounds never fully healed but could be honored through service, that memory kept the lost alive, that truth mattered even when it came too late, and he had kept his promise to Amy and to his mother to never let cases go cold, to never stop fighting for families. The years continued to pass and Bowling Green kept growing, and new generations learned about Amy Collins in history classes and in safety programs, and the story became part of the town's collective memory, a reminder of vigilance and the importance of protecting children. Lost River Cave Park implemented even more safety measures as technology advanced, including GPS tracking bracelets available for young children, drones that patrolled the trails, and an app that allowed parents to report concerns in real time to park rangers who could respond immediately. These measures were expensive, but the community supported them, understanding that prevention required investment, and they were named the Amy Collins Safety Initiative, ensuring her name remained connected to protection and awareness for generations to come. The photograph that solved Amy's case was digitized and shared with law enforcement agencies worldwide as part of training materials about photographic evidence, and it was studied in forensic courses at universities, analyzed in papers about cold case investigation, and cited in hundreds of cases that followed. Detective Sarah Chen died peacefully in her sleep in 2045 at the age of 101, and her obituary highlighted her distinguished career, and particularly her work on the Amy Collins case, noting that her persistence had brought closure to a family after 26 years. Michael attended her funeral and delivered a eulogy, thanking her for caring about his sister, for refusing to let the case remain unsolved, for using new technology to examine old evidence, and for giving his family the gift of truth when they had almost given up hope. He said Chen had taught him what it meant to be a detective, not just someone who investigated crimes, but someone who cared about the families behind them, who fought for justice even when it seemed impossible, who believed that answers existed if you searched long enough. The Amy Collins Memorial Cold Case Fund continued to operate, and by 2046 it had helped solve 43 cold cases across Kentucky and neighboring states, providing funding for DNA testing, photograph enhancement, genealogical research, and specialized training for investigators. Each solved case brought closure to a family that had been living in uncertainty, and each one honored Amy's memory by ensuring other families received the answers the Collins family had waited decades to receive, turning tragedy into tangible help for others. Michael's children grew up understanding the importance of their aunt's story, and his daughter became a forensic photographer specializing in evidence documentation and enhancement, carrying forward the legacy in a direct way, using the same technology that had revealed Keller's face in the picnic photo. His son became a child psychologist working with trauma survivors and families of missing children, providing the kind of support his own family had needed but rarely received. And both children understood that purpose could emerge from pain, that legacy was built through service. In 2050, 61 years after Amy's disappearance, the Bowling Green Police Department created a permanent exhibit in their lobby featuring Amy's case, and it included the original photograph and the enhanced version, the timeline of the investigation, and information about how the case was solved. Visitors to the police department could see the exhibit and learn about Amy, about the importance of preserving evidence, about how technology and persistence combined to solve cases that seemed impossible, and about how one family's tragedy had changed investigative practices nationwide. Michael attended the dedication ceremony at 81 years old, walking slowly but still strong, and he stood before the exhibit looking at his sister's 6-year-old face in the school photograph, at the image of Keller watching from the shadows, at the evidence that had spoken across decades. He thought about his parents, about how they had lived most of their adult lives not knowing what happened to Amy, about the moment they finally learned the truth, and he was grateful they had received answers even though those answers brought pain. He thought about the photograph his mother had taken trying to preserve happy memories, about how that single image had become the key to everything, about how she could never have known she was documenting the face of a predator who was watching her daughter. He thought about all the families still waiting for answers, still living in the uncertainty his family had endured, and he hoped the work that had been done in Amy's name would help bring them truth, would help other children be remembered and protected. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives, where new stories are shared every day. It's free and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence. Because families deserve answers and evidence deserves to be heard no matter how many years pass or how deeply secrets are buried. Amy Collins was 6 years old when she disappeared from a family picnic. She loved ladybugs and yellow dresses and following her big brother. She had curly brown hair and green eyes and a gap-toothed smile, and though her future was stolen, her story endured. Not as a tragedy alone, but as a catalyst for change, as proof that photographs contain hidden evidence, as inspiration for investigators to never stop searching, as a reminder that truth waits patiently in unexpected places, and as a legacy that protected countless children through awareness. Her mother's photograph captured more than a family moment. It captured a predator in the background, and that image waited 26 years to speak, to reveal its secret, to bring justice, and in the end, the truth emerged as it always does, persistent and patient, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what was hidden in plain sight.